It happened on December 24th, 2018, at exactly 7:12 p.m. While the gravy was still steaming and the Christmas lights above the dining room flickered like they always did, when too many plugs shared one socket. My mother set her fork down first. That should have warned me. There were 14 people at the table. My parents, my older brother Daniel and his wife, 3 aunts, 2 uncles, 5 cousins, and at the very end, on a booster seat I'd brought from home, my 8-year-old son Noah, swinging his legs under the table and whispering to himself as he counted the lights on the tree. The house smelled like pine, roasted turkey, and the cinnamon candles my mother insisted on lighting every year. It looked perfect. Magazine perfect. The kind of Christmas people post online with captions about gratitude and family. My father cleared his throat. "Let's keep this short," he said, glancing around as if this were a meeting and not dinner. My stomach tightened. He never said things like that unless he'd rehearsed them. My mother folded her napkin. She didn't look at me. She looked straight ahead, toward the centerpiece she'd arranged herself. "Red candles, fake holly, everything carefully placed. After tonight," she said, "we think it's best if you don't come back." I blinked once, certain I'd misheard. "Excuse me?" I asked. Daniel let out a small laugh. Not surprised, amused, like he'd been waiting for this part. My father finally looked at me. His voice stayed calm, almost polite. "We're asking you to leave, and not return." Noah stopped swinging his legs. The table went silent. Not shocked silence, not confused silence, the kind of silence that means people were warned ahead of time. I felt every eye shift toward me, then quickly away. Plates scraped softly. Someone cleared their throat. One of my aunts reached for her wine glass and missed the stem on the first try. "Tonight?" I asked. My mother nodded. "Tonight. And my son?" I said, though I already knew the answer. She hesitated just long enough to hurt. "You'll take care of him," she said. "That's your responsibility." Noah looked up at me then. His eyebrows pulled together the way they did when he was trying to understand adult conversations that didn't make sense. "Mom," he whispered. I reached over and rested my hand on his shoulder. I could feel how small he was under my palm. "Why?" I asked. My father exhaled slowly, as if I were being unreasonable. "We've supported you long enough." Supported. I almost smiled. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You're always playing the victim," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe this is the push you need." My mother finally looked at me then. Her eyes were dry. Decided. "You've made things uncomfortable," she said. "This isn't healthy for the family." Around us, Christmas lights glowed. The clock over the stove ticked loudly. Noah's breathing sped up, shallow and fast. I waited for someone to speak up. No one did. My father pushed his chair back slightly. "You can gather your things," he said. "We'll give you a few minutes." A few minutes. On Christmas Eve. I stood up slowly. Every movement felt unreal, like my body was doing things without asking me first. Noah slid off his booster seat and pressed against my side. His hand found mine, cold, shaking. As I guided him away from the table, I caught my mother's reflection in the window. She looked relieved, like something messy had finally been cleaned up. At the doorway, I stopped. "Just so we're clear," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "You're asking your daughter and your grandson to leave tonight with nowhere to go." My father nodded. "Yes." I looked at every face one last time. The people who had watched me grow up. The people who were still holding forks. "Okay," I said. I picked up Noah's coat from the hook by the door, slipped it over his shoulders, zipped it all the way to his chin. As we stepped into the cold, I heard my mother say, "Let's finish dinner before it gets cold." The door closed behind us. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Snow crunched under my shoes. Noah's breath puffed white into the air. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was 7:17 p.m., and in less than 5 minutes, everything they thought they knew about me was about to collapse. By the time Noah and I reached the car, my hands were steady. That wasn't new. Calm had become my default years ago, the way some people learn to swim because they grow up near water. Panic wastes time. Emotion clouds judgment. I'd learned that early, long before Christmas dinners turned into verdicts. I buckled Noah into the back seat of my 2011 Honda CR-V, the same car I'd driven for nearly 7 years. Reliable, paid off, warm. I turned, the heater on high, before getting into the driver's seat and waited until I heard his breathing slow. "Are we in trouble?" he asked softly. No, I said. We're just changing plans. He nodded like that made sense. Noah had always trusted me. Completely. That trust was the one thing I refused to break. As I pulled away from my parents' house, the windows glowed behind us. Laughter drifted faintly through the glass, muffled but unmistakable. Dinner resumed. Forks clinked. Wine poured. I didn't look back. People assume being told you don't belong must come as a shock. It isn't, when you've spent your whole life being prepared for it. I'd been independent since I was 19. Not because I wanted to prove anything, because it was safer. Dependence in my family came with conditions, and conditions always turned into leverage. After college, I moved 3 states away with 1 suitcase, a laptop, and a job offer I hadn't told anyone about until the contract was signed. I built my life quietly. No announcements. No asking for approval. I paid my bills. I raised my child. I showed up. That was it. To the outside world, I was stable, organized, boring even. To my family, that translated to invisible. My older brother, Daniel, had always been the opposite. Loud, charismatic, certain. He never doubted his place at the center of every room. My parents never doubted it either. Daniel got help. I got advice. Daniel got chances. I got lectures. When he dropped out of his first graduate program, my parents paid off his loans so he could start fresh. When I took a second job to cover childcare after Noah was born, my mother told me I should have planned better. They said it gently. That was the trick. My father enabled without speaking much at all. He believed silence kept peace. My mother managed the narrative. She decided who was doing well and who was concerning, and the family followed her lead. At holidays, Daniel's accomplishments were recited like headlines. My life was summarized in one sentence. She's managing. Managing meant I wasn't failing badly enough to worry about, and not succeeding loudly enough to celebrate. I never argued with that version of me. I didn't need to. What my family never asked, and never truly wanted to know, was how I managed. They didn't see the spreadsheets I kept, the emergency fund that covered 6 months of expenses, the certifications I completed at night after Noah fell asleep, the contracts I negotiated quietly, the signatures that came to me for approval before deals moved forward. They assumed calm meant small. They assumed silence meant weak. Even tonight at that table, my mother had used the same tone she always did, when she thought she was being reasonable. You've made things uncomfortable. Translation: you no longer fit the story we tell ourselves. Noah stirred in the back seat as we reached a red light. Are we going home? He asked. Yes, I said. Just not the house you think. I drove past the exit that led toward my parents' neighborhood and continued straight. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd stopped thinking of that house as home a long time ago. Home was the 2-bedroom condo I owned outright, 45 minutes away. It was small, quiet, ours. Noah's drawings were taped to the fridge. My calendar was pinned by the door. No one could vote us out of it. The red light turned green. As I drove, my phone buzzed once in the cup holder. A message. I didn't check it yet. Some things are better handled when you're parked. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Noah had leaned his head against the window, watching snowflakes melt as they touched the glass. Mom? He said again. Yes? Did I do something wrong? I swallowed. No, I said firmly. You did everything right. That was the truth. And the reason what happened next mattered so much wasn't because they'd thrown us out. It was because they'd done it assuming I had nowhere to land. They believed I needed them. They believed they were in control. They believed the story ended when the door closed behind us. At 7:21 p.m., I pulled into a grocery store parking lot, turned off the engine, and finally picked up my phone. The message was short, precise, and the moment I read it, I understood something my parents never would. They hadn't just made a cruel decision. They had made a catastrophic mistake. There's a strange clarity that comes when you stop hoping people will change. I didn't have that clarity as a child. Back then, I thought love was something you earned by being agreeable, useful and quiet. I learned early which version of myself caused the least friction, and I wore that version like armor. The pattern started small. It always does. When I was arena, Daniel broke my mother's favorite lamp while roughhousing in the living room. I was in the kitchen doing homework. My father found the pieces. Why were you running inside? He asked me. I stared at him, confused. I wasn't. Daniel stood behind him, eyes wide, innocent. My mother sighed. You know how clumsy you can be, she said to me. already sweeping glass into a dustpan. That was the first time I apologized for something I didn't do. It wouldn't be the last. By middle school, the rules were clear even if no one said them out loud. Daniel's mistakes were circumstances. Mine were character flaws. If he forgot to call, he was busy. If I did, I was inconsiderate. If he raised his voice, he was passionate. If I did, I was emotional. They never yelled. That's what made it harder to explain. Everything was framed as concern. "You're so sensitive," my mother would say, her hand on my arm, her voice soft. "We just worry about you." If I pushed back, even gently, she'd look wounded. My father would grow quiet. The room would tighten. So I learned to back down, to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one. By the time I was in 16, I'd stopped asking for rides, money, or permission. I got a job after school and saved every paycheck. When my parents praised Daniel for finding himself, after quitting another internship, I nodded along and didn't mention that. I'd been working 30 hours a week on top of school. It didn't matter. My achievements didn't fit their narrative. When I got into a good university, my mother said, "That's wonderful. Just don't let it go to your head." When Daniel failed a course, my father blamed the professor. The gaslighting was subtle, almost elegant. Anytime I expressed hurt, the story shifted. "That's not what I meant. You're remembering it wrong. You always twist things." Eventually, I stopped trusting my own reactions. If something felt unfair, I assumed I was overreacting. If I felt excluded, I told myself I was imagining it. That's how patterns survive. Not through force, but through doubt. When I became pregnant and was 26, unmarried and terrified, I didn't tell my parents right away. I waited until the second trimester, until I had a plan, until I'd already arranged childcare and adjusted my budget. My mother cried, not out of joy. "This will complicate everything," she said. "What will people think?" My father asked about the father. When I told him there wouldn't be one involved, he nodded like that explained everything he needed to know. Daniel clapped me on the shoulder. "Guess you're really doing life on hard mode," he joked. They offered advice. They offered opinions. They never offered help. When Noah was born, my mother visited once. She held him awkwardly, like a fragile object she wasn't sure she wanted. She stayed exactly 40 minutes. "He's very alert," she said before leaving. "Let's hope that doesn't turn into difficulty." I laughed it off at the time. But as Noah grew, the pattern tried to repeat itself. Daniel's kids were praised for being energetic. Noah was a handful. Daniel's parenting choices were respected. Mine were questioned. Once at a family barbecue, Noah tripped and skinned his knee. He cried. I picked him up, soothed him, kissed the scrape. My mother shook her head. "You coddle him," she said. "That's why he's so sensitive." I felt something harden in my chest then, a small, sharp click, like a lock turning. I didn't argue. I just adjusted. I stopped bringing Noah around as often. I shortened visits. I made excuses. Distance became my boundary long before I learned how to name it. Still, holidays pulled me back. Tradition has a gravitational pull, especially when guilt is involved. Every Christmas, the same script played out. Daniel arrived late and was celebrated anyway. I arrived on time and was asked to help in the kitchen. Noah was given loud toys that overwhelmed him, then scolded for being overwhelmed. And every year, I told myself it wasn't that bad, that they meant well. That family was complicated. That was the gaslighting talking. The message I'd seen in the grocery store parking lot replayed in my mind as I sat there with the engine off, snow drifting lazily onto the windshield. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't dramatic. It was factual. And it confirmed something I'd suspected for years. My family's treatment of me wasn't random. It wasn't misunderstanding. It wasn't concern. It was strategic. They'd grown used to a version of me that absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to. A version that didn't challenge, didn't expose, didn't require accountability. That version made things easy. But people who rely on someone's silence tend to panic when that silence ends. I looked at Noah in the rearview mirror again. He'd fallen asleep, his head tipped to the side, mouth slightly open. The faint scratch on his chin from earlier that day was already healing. I reached into my purse and touched the folder. Inside, thick, organized, labeled. I'd carried it with me for months without knowing exactly when I'd need it. Tonight, at that table when my parents told us to leave, I saw it clearly for the first time. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an eviction, and evictions are never about behavior. They're about control. They thought they were cutting me off. What they didn't realize was that I'd already documented everything. Dates, numbers, transfers, emails. All the things they assumed I was too distracted or too small to notice. The message on my phone had only confirmed the timing. I started the car again, turned onto the road, and drove toward home. Behind us, my parents were finishing dessert. Ahead of us, the story they'd carefully maintained for decades was beginning to crack, and they had no idea how much weight it was about to bear. The message I'd received in the grocery store parking lot didn't tell me what to do. It didn't need to. It simply said, "They're moving sooner than planned." No name, no signature, just that. I'd been expecting something like it ever since my mother started insisting, out of nowhere, that the whole family be together for Christmas this year. Not just immediate relatives, everyone. Cousins who hadn't spoken in years. Aunts who normally sent cards instead of showing up. Even my great-aunt Margaret, who hadn't left her assisted living apartment since spring. When people who avoid each other suddenly insist on unity, it's rarely about love. It's about witnesses. I pulled into my condo complex just after 7:40 p.m. Snow had already started to stick, coating the sidewalks in a thin, quiet white. I carried Noah inside, let him sleep in my arms a moment longer than necessary, then laid him gently on his bed with his coat still on. He stirred but didn't wake. I stood there for a while, watching his chest rise and fall, letting the quiet settle my thoughts. By the time I made myself a cup of tea, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my Aunt Helen. She never called. "Are you home?" she asked without preamble. "Yes." A pause. "Good." Another pause. Longer this time. "Listen," she said carefully. "I don't know what your parents told you tonight, but I want you to know something isn't right." I closed my eyes. Helen was my mother's older sister. Blunt. Observant. The kind of woman who noticed details and didn't bother pretending she hadn't. "What do you mean?" I asked. She exhaled sharply. "I mean, this didn't start tonight. And it isn't about you being difficult." I said nothing. "They've been asking questions," she continued. "About paperwork, about names, about what's in whose name." My grip tightened on the mug. Helen lowered her voice. "And about you." There it was. "What kind of questions?" I asked. "The kind you ask when you think someone doesn't know what they're sitting on," she said. "Or when you're trying to get ahead of something." "Get ahead of what?" She hesitated. "That's what worries me." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the steam curling off my tea. Christmas dinner hadn't been a breaking point. It had been a deadline, for years. My parents had been comfortable with my distance because it was quiet and voluntary. I visited less. I asked for nothing. I didn't challenge the hierarchy, but lately things had shifted. 2 months earlier, my mother had called to ask, casually, whether I'd updated my will. 3 weeks after that, my father had asked if Noah had a passport. Last week, Daniel's wife had cornered me in the hallway at a cousin's wedding and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "It must be exhausting doing everything alone." Each comment on its own meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern, and patterns are never accidental. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from my mother. I didn't return them. Instead, I opened the folder I'd carried for months and laid its contents out on the table. Bank statements, property records, emails printed and highlighted, copies of documents that had passed through my hands in a professional capacity, but touched my family's finances in personal ways. I hadn't gone looking for wrongdoing. I'd stumbled into it. 2 years earlier, my father had asked me to take a quick look at a document related to a family trust. He'd framed it as convenience. I worked in compliance. I understood language like that. As I reviewed it, something felt off. Numbers didn't align. Names were missing. Dates were inconsistent. When I asked for clarification, my father waved it off. "You're overthinking it," he said. "It's fine." It wasn't. I'd made copies then, quietly, just in case. That just in case had multiplied since. Now, as I spread everything out, I understood why my parents had wanted witnesses at Christmas. They'd been planning something. And whatever it was, they needed me out of the way. At 11:03 a.m., my mother finally left a voicemail. Her tone was measured, controlled. "We need to talk," she said. As a family. I deleted it. An hour later, Daniel texted, "Let's not make this ugly. Come by later." I didn't respond. Instead, I called Aunt Margaret. She was an 86, sharp as a blade, and had outlived 3 husbands and every family lie that came with them. She listened as I explained, quietly, carefully, what had happened the night before. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "They wouldn't do that unless they were scared." That landed harder than anything else. Scared people rush. They make mistakes. They overplay their hand. "Are you coming to the New Year's brunch?" she asked. "What brunch?" She snorted. "Exactly. They're hosting. This Sunday. Whole family again. Didn't tell you?" No, they hadn't. "They'll expect you to stay away," she said. "They'll say you chose distance." "Should I?" I asked. "No," she said immediately. "You should come, calm, polite, and prepared." I glanced at the folder on my table. "I am," I said. That Sunday morning, I dressed simply. No jewelry, neutral colors, the same version of myself they were used to underestimating. I packed Noah's backpack with snacks and books and told him we were visiting family for a little while. "Will they be mad?" he asked. "Not at you," I said. When we arrived, the house was already full. Cars lined the street. Laughter spilled out onto the lawn. My mother opened the door herself. Her smile froze when she saw me. "Oh," she said. "You came?" "Yes," I said calmly. "You invited the family?" Her eyes flicked past me to Noah, then back to my face. "Well," she said, stepping aside. "Let's not make a scene." Inside, conversation slowed. Heads turned. People watched. I felt it then. The tension stretched thin and deliberate. This wasn't a reconciliation. It was a setup. And somewhere in that house, between the coffee and the forced laughter, someone was about to make a move they wouldn't be able to take back. The brunch table was set like a display. White tablecloth, matching place settings, mimosas poured before anyone asked. My mother moved through the room with practiced ease, greeting people, touching shoulders, laughing at just the right volume. If anyone noticed how tightly she was holding herself together, they didn't comment on it. I took a seat near the end of the table. Noah sat beside me, flipping quietly through a book. I kept my posture relaxed. Hands folded. Neutral expression. Calm unnerves people who expect emotion. Daniel arrived late, as usual, slipping into the seat across from me. He didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, his smile was thin. "Didn't think you'd show," he said. "I was invited," I replied. My mother clinked her glass. "Let's all sit," she said brightly. "We have some things to talk about." The room obeyed. That was the moment I knew this was deliberate. She didn't start with me. She never did. First came compliments for Daniel. His work, his stress, his sacrifices, his family. My parents nodded along, beaming. Then she sighed. "You know," she said, "family finances can get complicated." Several people shifted in their chairs. "We've all been very generous over the years," my father added. "But generosity only works when there's trust." My name wasn't spoken. Not yet. My mother turned to me slowly. "We've been concerned," she said, "about some choices you've made." I waited. "About stability," she continued. "About responsibility." I could feel eyes on me now. Curious, uneasy. "You've always struggled," she said gently, "and we've tried to help." That word again, help. Daniel leaned forward. "Mom's just saying we worry," he said, his tone rehearsed. "Especially with Noah involved." Noah stiffened beside me. I placed my hand over his. My mother nodded gravely. "We don't think it's appropriate for you to continue representing yourself as independent." There it was. "What does that mean?" I asked calmly. She glanced at my father, then back at me. "It means we've had to step in more than you realize." Silence spread across the table. "Your father and I have been covering certain expenses," she said, "helping manage things behind the scenes." My father slid a manila envelope onto the table. "This is about accountability," he said. The envelope was thick. My heart rate didn't change. I recognized the papers inside before he even opened it. He pulled out a few documents and spread them neatly in front of him. "Over the years," he said, "we've transferred funds to make sure you and Noah were taken care of." A murmur moved through the room. My mother watched my face closely, waiting for panic, for embarrassment, for gratitude. None came. "We've decided," she continued, "that moving forward we need to formalize things. For Noah's sake," she paused, "that means certain decisions will no longer be solely yours." There it was. Control, dressed up as concern. "So," she said softly, "we think it's best if Noah spends more time here. Where there's structure." The word landed like a slap. Noah's fingers tightened around mine. My Aunt Helen inhaled sharply. Someone dropped a spoon. "You're suggesting," I began. "We're saying," my father interrupted, "that perhaps temporary guardianship would be appropriate." The room froze. My mother leaned forward, voice lowered, compassionate. "We don't want to make this public," she said. "But if necessary, we will." That was the humiliation. Not loud, not dramatic. Calculated. I looked around the table. At the people avoiding my eyes. At the ones clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. At the ones who looked relieved it wasn't them. I took a breath. Then I smiled. It was small, polite. "I see," I said. Daniel frowned. "Why are you smiling?" "Because," I said evenly, "you've just accused me of being dependent using documents." "You don't understand." My mother blinked. "Excuse me?" I reached into my bag and placed my own folder on the table. Thicker, tabbed, labeled. "This," I said, tapping it once, "is every transaction you just referenced." My father stiffened. "You see," I continued, "none of those transfers were support." I slid a document toward my Aunt Helen. They were reimbursements. I slid another toward my uncle. "For expenses incurred on behalf of a trust you mismanaged." Another. "Expenses I covered personally when vendors weren't paid." The room shifted. Daniel sat back slowly. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact," I said calmly, "that the money you think you gave me was money I fronted first." My mother's color drained. "That's not possible," she said. "It is," I replied. "And it's documented." I looked directly at her. "You assumed I wouldn't notice," I said quietly. "Because you taught me not to speak." My father's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages. "These numbers," he began, "are accurate," I finished. "Down to the cent." Silence pressed in, heavy, uncomfortable. No one spoke. I leaned back in my chair. "And as for Noah," I said, my voice steady, "you will not discuss custody again. Not privately, not publicly, not ever." My mother opened her mouth. I raised a hand. "This conversation," I said, "is over." For the first time, she didn't interrupt me. Around the table, people avoided my parents' eyes. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Something had cracked. I gathered my folder and stood. Noah looked up at me. "Can we go?" he asked. "Yes," I said. As I turned toward the door, my Aunt Helen finally spoke. "Maybe," she said carefully, "we should all take a break." No one argued. As Noah and I walked out, I could feel it. The balance had changed. They hadn't expected proof. They hadn't expected calm. They hadn't expected me to stand without asking permission. Outside, the cold air hit my face. I didn't feel victorious. I felt done. And as we drove away, I knew something else too. This wasn't finished. But it was no longer theirs to control. If you've ever sat in a room where the truth was weaponized against you, if you've ever been made to feel small through concern and help, you already know how heavy silence can be. The question is, what happens when that silence finally breaks? I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid, but because my brain had finally shifted into a mode. I knew well, the one where emotion steps aside and facts take over. Once that switch flips, there's no going back. You stop wondering if something is wrong and start mapping out how it works. By 9:15 a.m., Noah was still asleep. The condo quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. The folder from the brunch spread neatly beside it. This was the part no one ever sees in stories like this. The unglamorous part. The part where justice is built line by line, document by document. I worked in compliance for a living. Not the flashy kind people imagine. No courtroom speeches. No dramatic confrontations. My job was quieter. I made sure systems held up under scrutiny. I found inconsistencies. I followed money. And money, unlike people, always tells the truth. I started with the trust. The family trust had been created when my grandparents passed, ostensibly to benefit all descendants equally. That's what everyone believed. That's what my parents said at every holiday when finances came up. What the paperwork actually showed was different. Over the last 9 years, there had been a series of temporary reallocations. Small at first, then larger. Funds moved out under vague justifications. Maintenance, administrative expenses, emergency coverage. Always approved by my father. Always undocumented beyond a single signature. I pulled up bank records and cross-referenced them with vendor invoices. The same names appeared again and again. Contractors who hadn't done work. Services never rendered. Payments rounded too cleanly to be coincidence. By our 8:40 a.m., I had a spreadsheet that told a very clear story. The trust hadn't been mismanaged accidentally. It had been used. By my parents. For Daniel. Down payments. Tuition assistance. Business loans that were never repaid. Credit card balances quietly cleared. And when the trust ran short, they borrowed from elsewhere. From accounts they didn't technically own. From reimbursements that passed through my hands because I'd been asked, years ago, to help streamline things. That was the mistake they made. They'd assumed that because I was quiet, I wasn't careful. They'd assumed I wouldn't keep copies. They'd assumed I wouldn't notice patterns. By 11:20 a.m., I had flagged more 41270 in improper transfers. That number didn't even make me angry. It made me calm, because numbers like that don't get explained away. They don't get smoothed over with tone or intention. They don't care how worried someone claims to be. They just exist. I sent one email, short, professional. No accusations, no emotion. Just a request for clarification sent to the trust's external accounting firm. With attachments, I CC'd one person only, Aunt Margaret. At 12:17 p.m., my phone rang. My father. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 2 minutes later. Then my mother. Then Daniel. By the fourth call, I turned the phone face down and made Noah lunch. He ate happily, unaware that the ground under an entire family narrative was starting to give way. At 2:03 p.m., the accounting firm replied. Their tone was cautious, formal. They requested a meeting. That was faster than I'd expected. By 3:30 p.m., Aunt Margaret called. They're panicking, she said without preamble. I know, I replied. Your mother called me, she continued. She says you're confused, that you've misunderstood some numbers. I almost smiled. That's interesting, I said. Because the numbers are the only things that aren't confused. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you know what this means? Yes, I said. It means they tried to scare me into compliance before anyone else caught on. That's right, she said. And now they're out of time. The next day, a letter arrived by courier. Not a text, not an email. A letter. My parents' lawyer. It was written in the careful language of people who want to sound authoritative without committing to anything concrete. Concern. Family harmony. Misunderstandings. Request to pause further action. I read it once. Then I placed it in the folder. At 10 a.m. the following morning, the accounting firm held a conference call. My parents were on the line. So was Daniel. So was Aunt Margaret. And so was an attorney I'd hired quietly 6 months earlier, just in case. My parents spoke first. They sounded tired, defensive. My mother cried at one point. My father spoke about intentions. I said nothing. When it was my turn, I didn't accuse. I explained. I walked through the numbers. The dates. The flow of funds. The missing documentation. The conflicts of interest. I used a calm, factual tone. The kind that doesn't invite debate. Halfway through, Daniel interrupted. This is ridiculous, he said. You're blowing this out of proportion. The accountant cleared his throat. Actually, he said carefully, she's not. Silence followed. Then the phrase that changed everything. We're obligated to report this. My mother gasped. My father started talking quickly. I muted my microphone. I didn't need to add anything. By the end of the call, the trust was frozen pending investigation. Control had shifted. Not through shouting. Not through humiliation. Through receipts. That evening, my parents sent a group message to the family. They framed it as a temporary review. They suggested privacy. They implied betrayal without naming names. The responses were telling. Some relatives said nothing. Others asked questions. A few defended them instinctively. But the tone had changed. The certainty was gone. And certainty is what power feeds on. That night after Noah was asleep, I sat on the couch and allowed myself one moment of reflection. Not satisfaction. Relief. Because the truth about situations like this is simple and uncomfortable. People who build their authority on your silence don't fear your anger. They fear your clarity. And clarity, once documented, is irreversible. At 11:48 p.m., my phone buzzed with one final message from my mother. We never thought you'd do this. I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed back, You never thought I could. And for the first time in my life, that sentence didn't feel like defiance. It felt like a statement of fact. The call came 3 days later. Not from my parents, not from Daniel. From Aunt Margaret. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before. Not anger, not fear, something colder. Sit down, she said. This isn't about money anymore. I did. Outside, snow slid off the roof of the neighboring building in soft sheets. Inside, the condo was quiet except for Noah humming to himself in his room, building something out of blocks. "What is it?" I asked. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I went digging. Not just into the trust, into your childhood." I closed my eyes. "There are things," she continued, "that were deliberately kept from you. Things your parents agreed never to discuss." My chest tightened. "About what?" "About why you were treated differently." That landed harder than any accusation could have. "For years," Margaret said, "I assumed your mother was just difficult, controlling, jealous maybe. But it was more than that." She paused. "You weren't supposed to stay." I opened my eyes. "What do you mean?" "You were never part of the long-term plan," she said plainly. "Not the way Daniel was." The room felt smaller. "When your grandmother died," Margaret continued, "she left specific instructions. Not suggestions, instructions. I could hear papers rustling on her end. "She left you something," Margaret said. "Something separate." I swallowed. "That doesn't make sense. Everything went into the trust." "No," she said. "That's what your parents said." I stood up without realizing it. "Your grandmother didn't trust your parents to be fair," Margaret said quietly. "Especially where you were concerned." My hands trembled slightly. "She left you the house on Maple Ridge," Margaret continued. "The one that was sold when you were 12. My heart dropped. "That house was sold to pay for Daniel's college," I said automatically. I'd heard that story 100 times. Margaret was silent for a moment. "No," she said. "It was sold because your parents didn't want you to have it." The words hung between us. "That house was willed to you," she went on. "In trust until you turned 30. Your parents contested it." I felt dizzy. "They argued you weren't stable enough," Margaret said. "That you were too sensitive, too uncertain, that Daniel needed the resources more." My stomach twisted. "They won," she added, "because no one challenged them." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because," Margaret said, "the documents surfaced." I gripped the edge of the table. "When the trust was frozen," she explained, "everything was reviewed, including the original estate files." There was a pause. "Your parents didn't just misuse funds," she said. "They suppressed an inheritance." I sank back into my chair. The pieces slid into place with terrifying clarity. The favoritism, the constant reminders that I was too much, or not enough. The way my independence had always been framed as a flaw instead of a strength. The way they'd tried to position me as dependent now, of all times. They weren't just afraid of losing control. They were afraid of exposure. "If this comes out," I said slowly, "what happens?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "They lose everything. Not metaphorically, legally, socially, irreversibly." I thought of my mother's voice at Christmas. "You've made things uncomfortable." I thought of my father's calm certainty when he told me to leave. I thought of Daniel's smile. It hadn't been cruelty for cruelty's sake. It had been strategy. "You should know," Margaret added. "They're trying to frame this as your retaliation. They're saying you're unstable, vindictive." I let out a slow breath. "Of course they are. They want to discredit you before this becomes public," she said. "They're reaching out to relatives, telling their version." "Let them," I said. Margaret was quiet. "You're not going to expose them?" she asked. I looked toward Noah's room, at the quiet proof of the life I'd built without them. "I'm going to tell the truth," I said. "There's a difference." Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." I stared at it for a long moment. Then another message followed. "Mom's not well. You're hurting her." There it was. The last card. I typed one sentence back. "You already took what was mine. This is just the part where it's seen." I turned the phone off. That night, as I tucked Noah into bed, he asked, "Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at you?" I smoothed his hair back. "They're dealing with consequences," I said. He considered that. "Is that different?" "Yes," I said softly. "Very different." When I turned off the light, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger, not triumph, understanding. My childhood hadn't been an accident. It had been engineered, and the people who built that system were finally realizing something they never planned for. I'd grown up, and I was no longer small enough to control. The meeting took place the following Friday, in the same formal dining room where my parents once hosted charity luncheons and holiday. Dinners like theater productions. Only this time there were no decorations. No candles, no tablecloth, no attempt at warmth. Just polished wood, straight-backed chairs, and the quiet presence of people who had come not to celebrate, but to judge. Aunt Margaret sat at the head of the table. She hadn't asked for permission. At 86, she didn't need to. The rest of the family filtered in slowly. Some avoided eye contact. Some nodded stiffly. A few offered tentative smiles that faded when I didn't return them. My parents arrived last. They looked older than I remembered. My mother's posture was rigid, as if holding herself together required constant effort. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly it pulsed when he spoke. Daniel sat beside them, arms crossed, eyes darting. Noah stayed home with a sitter. This wasn't a room for children. Margaret didn't waste time. "We're here because facts have been verified," she said evenly, "and because silence has protected the wrong people for too long." No one interrupted her. "The trust is under formal investigation," she continued. "Independent accountants have confirmed misappropriation of funds." My father opened his mouth. Margaret lifted a hand. "You will listen," she said. "You've done enough talking." The room stilled. She turned toward me. "The original estate documents from your grandmother have been authenticated," she said. "They clearly state that the Maple Ridge property was willed to you." My mother's breath hitched. "That property was sold without your knowledge," Margaret continued, "and the proceeds were redirected." She looked directly at my parents. "You contested the will. You won on the basis of claims that were never substantiated, and you never disclosed the outcome to the beneficiary." Daniel stood abruptly. "This is insane," he said. "You're acting like criminals." Margaret's gaze snapped to him. "You benefited," she said flatly. "That doesn't make you innocent." He sat back down. The room felt heavy now, pressurized. "Because of this," Margaret said, "the family will be taking the following steps." She slid a document across the table. "Restitution," she said. "Full accounting. And legal responsibility where applicable." My mother shook her head. "You can't do this," she whispered. "We're family." Margaret's expression softened, not with sympathy, but with finality. "Family doesn't steal from children," she said. "And it doesn't lie about it for decades." I remained silent. That was important. Justice doesn't need a narrator. The consequences spoke clearly enough on their own. My parents were required to step down as trustees immediately. Control transferred to a third party. Daniel's financial support was suspended pending review. Socially, the shift was immediate. Relatives who once deferred to my parents now asked questions. Invitations stopped. Phone calls went unanswered. Not out of cruelty, out of recalibration. Power had changed hands, and everyone could feel it. As the meeting ended, my father finally turned to me. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "Yes," I said. "I did. Not out of revenge, out of necessity." My mother looked at me then, really looked, not as a problem, not as a liability, as someone she no longer understood. "You've destroyed this family," she said, her voice breaking. I shook my head once. "No," I replied. "I stopped carrying it alone." That was the last thing I said to them that day. I didn't stay to watch reactions. I didn't linger for apologies that weren't coming. I gathered my coat, nodded once to Margaret, and left. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. Snow glittered faintly on the pavement. I stood there for a moment, breathing. Inside that house, a system built on favoritism and silence was collapsing under its own weight. Inside me, something else had finally settled. I hadn't won. I had ended something. And endings, when they're honest, don't require celebration. They require boundaries. As I drove away, my phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown number. "You could have handled this privately." I didn't reply, because privacy had been the problem. And this, finally, was accountability. Life doesn't reset after moments like that. It steadies, quietly, incrementally, in ways that don't announce themselves. In the weeks that followed, nothing dramatic happened on the surface. No public apologies. No sudden reversals. No emotional reunions. My parents didn't call. Daniel didn't text. The silence that followed wasn't the tense kind anymore. It was empty, final, and for the first time, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. Noah noticed the difference before I did. "You smile more now," he said one morning as I packed his lunch. "Not big. Just here." He pointed to his cheeks. I paused, then nodded. "I think you're right. Our days settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Mornings were calm. Evenings were unhurried. The condo, once just practical, began to feel lighter. I moved furniture, hung new curtains, let Noah choose paint for his room, soft blue, like the sky he liked to watch when snow fell. Work continued, steady, focused. I was promoted quietly, without ceremony. More responsibility, more autonomy, the kind of progress that doesn't require permission. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the trust's legal counsel. Restitution had been approved. Not everything could be undone. Time doesn't refund itself. But funds were reallocated, assets corrected, a separate account established, one that belonged to me, unquestionably. I stared at the numbers for a long time, not because of what they meant financially, but because of what they represented. Proof, not of wrongdoing, but of reality. I hadn't imagined my childhood. I hadn't exaggerated my pain. I hadn't been too sensitive or difficult or unstable. I had been right. That truth settled something deep in my chest that therapy alone never quite reached. Aunt Margaret and I spoke often after that. She never apologized for the past. She didn't need to. She showed up now, and that mattered more. They built their power on silence, she told me once. And you ended it without shouting. That's rare. My parents moved to a smaller place. I heard that secondhand. Friends drifted away from them. Not because of gossip, but because people finally understood who they'd been protecting. Daniel tried once. He showed up at my door without warning, eyes tired, confidence stripped thin. I didn't know, he said, about the house, about any of it. I believed him, but belief doesn't undo harm. I know, I replied, and that's why this ends here. He nodded, didn't argue, left without asking for anything. That mattered too. Years passed. Noah grew taller, louder, kinder. He learned what boundaries looked like by watching me keep mine. He learned that family isn't defined by proximity, but by safety. One night, years later, as we sat on the couch watching snow fall outside the window, he leaned against me and said, "I'm glad we left that house." "So am I," I replied. "What would have happened if we hadn't?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. "We would have kept shrinking," I said. "And that's not who we are." He nodded, satisfied. When I look back now, I don't remember the Christmas dinner as the moment I was thrown out. I remember it as the moment I stopped waiting to be let in. They thought power meant deciding who stayed at the table. They were wrong. Power was building a life so steady that being asked to leave no longer felt like exile. It felt like release. I am not the child they dismissed. I am not the problem they tried to manage. I am not the version of me they needed to control. I am a mother. I am capable. I am calm. And I didn't lose my family that night. I reclaimed myself. Quietly, completely.